This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages. I'm your host, Jonathan, and this is episode 34, Pope P.O.W. the First. Today we build upon the narrative of the Norman invasion of the Italian peninsula, and it all comes to a head on this episode. We have a ton of topics to cover, but first, I want to do something I've waited a long time to be able to do. On this episode, I get to give my first full-hearted and infinitely appreciative thank you to Megan B., who has graciously donated a monthly sum to help this podcast become ad-free. Megan has chosen to become a supporting listener through Anchor, so please feel free to head over there if you too would like to give to the show, but don't forget this podcast is also set up on Patreon as well. Megan B., wherever you are, there are no words except thank you. You are officially our first paid supporter of the show. All right, folks. That announcement happens to come after the long-awaited episode when the Normans are forced into a strange position on the peninsula, a position they're not exactly used to. So get ready. The Southern Normans, the leader of the Latin Church, it's time for a reckoning. I hope you enjoy the show. Resentment is a pretty soft word to use when trying to describe the Norman-Italian relationship in southern Italy. For at least 2 decades, Normans have pretty much had their way with the Italians living throughout the regions of Apulia and Calabria. Resentment? Psh! The Normans blew by resentment light years ago, and they landed squarely on hatred. See, these Italians were a pretty solid mixture of various peoples who've settled southern Italy to take advantage of the location in terms of trade. Trade and farming, that is, at least in the case of Apulia, a place still known today for its unbelievably fertile soil. As for Calabria, as breathtaking as the views are in that more mountainous region, that is, Calabria being those lands heading outward toward the toe of the boot, that region was seen more or less as a Wild West of sorts. This was the region Robert de Hauteville tried to tame, but ended up simply surviving. And with a heavy dose of brilliant cleverness and a pinch of propagandistic panache, well, he emerged from this debacle in the rough areas of Calabria, a folk hero among the Normans. A growing legend, actually. Among the Normans. Yeah, among the Normans, not the Italians. See, as long as the Normans have staked a claim in southern Italy, the people, largely made up of descendants of those revered ancient Romans, but also a heavy Greek influence from centuries of Byzantine settlers. These were the people who bore the brunt of the growing Norman presence. There were also pockets of Lombards, people who invaded a couple of centuries earlier from southern Germany, who eventually intermarried and spread out, but they mostly stayed by their other Lombard communities, those regional presences called Salerno, Capua, and Benevento mainly. The Normans had an off-and-on relationship with these Lombard communities, either through warfare or marriage, but this action and social movement all took place at the highest points of society. Other Norman knights, not just the Hautevilles or Drangos to be sure, were also doing the same. That is, marrying among the nobility in Apulia and Calabria. And by then, with the blessing years earlier, Normans, then under the leadership of Rainulf Drango, were free to cut up the lands that comprised the new principality of Melfi. But what happens when a snake outgrows its skin? Well, it sheds it off. It finds a way to keep itself whole while also finding the space in which to expand. And this leads us to the pivotal question behind this entire plotline in history. this story of the Southern Normans, as they came to be called. The question is this: why Italy? No, seriously, why Italy? Listen, no one is 100% sure as to why the Normans focused so heavily on southern Italy and Sicily during the 11th century, but it doesn't take much research into Norman customs to start to paint a pretty vivid picture as to a possible answer. But it's a two-parter, so let's follow along here. The first part is simple. Italy was a battleground. Actually, it was multiple battlegrounds. In the north, Italy was overwhelmingly dominated by the Holy Roman Empire. And in that region, it was dominated within the empire of the Genoese, the Burgundians, the Lombards, Swabians, and the Venetians. In the middle of the Italian boot were other Lombard principalities that ultimately held vassalage to the Holy Roman Emperor. Its southernmost Lombard principality being the Principality of Benevento, located on the Adriatic side opposite Rome. Keep an eye on that name. That's one you're going to hear later today. The middle of Italy and the northeast to the former imperial Roman capital of Ravenna was the domain by the 11th century of the Papal States. The Papal States, interestingly, was both within and without the Holy Roman Empire. But that's a story for a podcast all its own, believe me, so we won't begin to get into that relationship at the moment. And as for the southern regions of Italy, well, we've spoken so much about them, I feel that naming the Lombard provinces of Capua and Salerno, the very Byzantine Calabria, and the rich and prosperous Byzantine-led but Lombard-populated Apulia should suffice. So from this first point as to why Italy, I'd say that there were a plethora of moving pieces on this chessboard. Once dominant, yet currently waning Lombard supremacy seemed to be the main driver here, from north to south, in my estimation. But Eastern Orthodox versus Latin Rite Christianity was also a major conversation happening here too. And what about bustling southern Byzantine ports influencing the trade up the Adriatic coast? Greek culture versus Germanic Lombard culture versus traditional reheated leftover Roman culture. And with the emergence of the Papal States, Germanic autocracy versus Christian theocracy versus Byzantine autocracy, where is that line drawn? This is the crazy environment that the Normans were swept up into and then stayed for. It was this turmoil and this insecurity and this instability that the Normans sought to capitalize on. And there was one other major factor that drove Normans specifically to continue to travel to southern Italy in droves. The thing that drove these young knights out of Normandy was, ironically, the thing that was built into the very structure Norman society flourished upon. It's the idea of primogeniture. Primogeniture is the idea that the firstborn inherit the family's land and properties, as well as vassals and towns, etc. So in the case of Tancred de Hauteville, that pious bunny rabbit that he was, what were the rest of his brood going to do when they came of age? In those days, many sons were given land by their wealthy fathers as a starter home of sorts, a place with which to build upon. With land comes opportunities for advancement, say, into knighthood, which afforded a bounty more for the young man. Along with this land came a wife. Now, marriage, as we've said before in the 11th century, was simply not, a matter of love. The concept of love and marriage was a laughable notion, most likely met with jeers and a swift kick in the rear as you're excused from the adult table. So noble families like the Hautevilles, with the small amount of land owned, comparatively speaking, of course, along with that basketball team of ambitious sons, what were these sons to do when they reached maturity and must create a life for themselves? Families like the Hautevilles, of which there were more than you'd think in Normandy at the time, had no answer for the crisis of primogeniture within the ranks. If no outlet presented itself, resentment could easily breed unhealthy competitiveness, thus fracturing and ultimately destroying a family. In these situations across Europe where primogeniture was the custom, fratricide wasn't unheard of. Normandy by the 11th century was quickly becoming pretty crowded. And the Cotentin, the peninsula where the Hautevilles hailed, well, that was already a pretty crowded place. Remember that snake that grew too big for its own skin? That snake was Normandy. But despite the little ventures into Brittany and Maine, things we will talk about soon, Normandy really didn't have too many more places to expand into. France was just crowded. Crowded with other powerful barons. Though economically prosperous, socially diverse, and militarily adept, France was no picnic to live in during the 11th century, each domain vying for power over the other and even leading raids and campaigns of acquisition against other French domains. And Norman families had difficult choices to make in the 11th century. Well, at least their children did. The male children, at least. The daughters could either be married off or sent to a convent. Simple. Well, not ideal, but still simple. But the boys? It wasn't so simple with the boys. I mean, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows and lollipops here for anyone. It was the 11th century. But despite some jockeying for position in the Channel and North Sea regions, Normandy itself, the duchy, was experiencing a bit of prosperity during the late 10th and early 11th centuries, under, if you remember, some fairly respectable leadership. And you know what they say about societies with long periods of economic stability, right? Yeah, exactly. You get a whole slew of Tancred de Hautevilles. So what do you do with all these kids? They need a place to stay, a place to put their heads at night, a place to raise a family, a place from which to build their own legacies. So with limited land availability and the deeply ingrained practice of primogeniture, this is a recipe for a community quite literally bursting at the seams. Thus, the de Hautevilles, in their infatuation with experiencing the excitement and adventure of the majestic lands in southern Italy, a land in flux and turmoil, and they heard all of these stories of the Drangos' adventures battling the Lombards on Monday, buying back their fellow Norman P.O.Ws on Wednesday, and fighting with those same Lombards on Friday against the allies they fought with on Monday. It was crazy. Southern Italy was certainly populated, but it was nothing like Normandy. And in addition to the room to stretch one's elbows, southern Italy was also an area where there was little oversight. That is, little local governorship over the people. For instance, the people of Calabria were predominantly Greek and held Eastern Christian beliefs. Therefore, it can be implied that Calabrians were more loyal to Constantinople than they were to Rome. And as for Apulia, the Eastern Roman Empire certainly held sway there too, but the Lombards in the area were continuously making it difficult to govern from such a distance as Constantinople. And shoot, by the time the Normans arrived and were recruited, the expulsion of Byzantine control was almost a given, which made the popes very, very happy for Norman knights. The only question left was, would this new land that the Normans have more or less freed up, would it fall under papal, Lombard, or Norman control on the other side of these political shifts? See, by 1052, Lombards started seeing the Italian boot for what it was, a sandbox, something the Normans had seen it as for a very long time. Everything that was built was subject to be demolished by a neighbor. Every resource discovered was subject to be snatched up by the kid next to you. And every so often a new kid would plop him or herself down right smack in the middle and stake a claim to anything he or she wanted. Toys, friends, territory, it didn't matter. At one point, the Lombards themselves were that obnoxious new kid, if they sat and thought about it for just a hot minute. It was only a matter of time before a new kid would join the playdate here. Who do you think this new kid turned out to be? Well, so what could they do about it at this point? So by 1053, the stage was most certainly set for something to give. The Italian teapot was steaming and a release was necessary. Recently, we learned of Drogo de Hauteville's fate on his way back from a meeting with Pope Leo IX, but we didn't exactly find out what happened. The intrigue at play here was just too much to go into at the time, but this is a perfect time to unfold this part of the story. But to catch us up to this meeting, we must first take a somewhat brief look at Pope Leo IX himself. Before becoming the Bishop of Rome, he was called Bruno of Egisheim, born in Alsace, then a part of the Holy Roman Empire's Duchy of Swabia. He was born in 1002-ish, and by his 24th birthday, he had created a highly respectable and pious reputation, as well as a reputation as a man of letters, philosophy, and organizational leadership, which thrust him in 1026 into the role of the Bishop of Toul, then a part of the Holy Roman Empire, but now it's located in France. Bishop Bruno would serve that diocese from 1026 to 1049, all the while creating a vast network of supporters as well as enemies around Latin Christendom, and becoming an advisor of sorts to two Holy Roman emperors, both Conrad II and Henry III. During this tenure as the Bishop of Toul, Bruno became equally known for his deep intelligence in church structure and traditions, his innate ability to broker peace between warring factions, and, get this, his ability to handle himself militarily in an armed conflict. Yeah, this man of peace hid an inner George Patton, apparently. In 1049, after a couple embarrassing years in which Rome couldn't keep a houseplant alive, let alone a pope. See, it went like this. Pope Clement II was likely poisoned by his successor, Pope Benedict IX, who was then replaced by Pope Damasus II, who lasted only 23 days, due to either that brutal Roman summer heat or a bit more poison by old Benedict IX. No one's really sure. So Bishop Bruno, in that 1049 year, reluctantly picked up the phone and answered Henry III's incessant calling for him to become pope. But in Bruno's eyes, it wasn't that simple. Oh, well, it was a pretty secure bet that Bruno would be the next pope due to his reputation, his unanimous vote at the Council of Worms in December 1048, confirming this appointment as pope. And the fact that he also happened to be the emperor's second cousin. That always helps, But again, Bruno may have been boosted by a touch of nepotism, but he was still a man of God, a truly pious man by all accounts. He would assume the role on one condition, as historian John Julius Norwich puts it in his book, The Other Conquest, which is about the Norman conquest of southern Italy and Sicily. Norwich writes, quote, "He agreed only on condition that his appointment would be spontaneously ratified by the clergy and people of Rome on his arrival, and accordingly set out for the Eternal City in January 1049, dressed as a simple pilgrim." End quote. On his way south, he stopped at the abbey in the town of Besançon, in what is today east-central France, near the border with Switzerland. He met the new abbot there, a Cluniac monk named Hugh. Now, Hugh was only 20 years old at the time, but he would wield an enormous amount of influence for the latter half of the 11th century, but at the time, he was still getting his sea legs, and no doubt Bishop Bruno, also a member of the monastic order of Cluny, probably looked upon this talented young man in much the same way as others looked at him back in 1026 when he first became a bishop. And it just so happens the year that Hugh is suspected to have been born. Also, while visiting this abbey, Bruno would meet and befriend a man named Hildebrand, and Hildebrand would agree to join Bruno on his pilgrimage to Rome. Both men, upon approaching the entrance to Rome, must have breathed deeply. There was a lot riding on this visit. It wasn't a given that the people of Rome, let alone the clergy, would agree to Bruno's assumption to the papacy. Rome by the 11th century was hardly the sophisticated and refined place you and I may hold dear in our imaginations. This was not the Rome of, well, Roman times. This was not the Rome of philosophy or the Rome of elaborate building projects or the Rome of economic prosperity. No, this was a Rome that had been left to rot and decay and be hassled by violent uprisings from outsiders, political corruption from insiders, and natural disasters galore. It was, one would call it, nothing more than a hive of scum and villainy in the mid-11th century, if you know what I mean. These Romans had developed a little reputation of their own for letting off a little bit of steam. Now, of course, there were wealthier, cleaner, nicer parts of town, but it was a far cry from the Rome we may be thinking of by the time Bruno and Hildebrand walked through its streets in pilgrim's rags, unkempt and hungry. But Bruno's tactic worked, coming to town as a mere servant of the people. Rome, its people and its clergy, overwhelmingly welcomed the two men, and Bruno was immediately consecrated under the name Leo IX. And just as quickly, Bruno, Pope Leo IX, got to work. At heart, he was a reformer, and being a Cluniac, his first act was to create an agenda with the central focus of restoring Latin Christianity's homage to a strong central authority, the papacy in Rome. This differed from the older Benedictine structure, which allowed a somewhat looser structural interpretation, allowing localities to bend their organizational practices to the local culture and norms. So, though Cluniacs were a massive force in European Christendom at this time, the ancient Benedictine order was still in the upper halls of ecclesiastic power. That is, until Bruno became Leo IX. There was also the issue of abbeys and monasteries and bishoprics owning land and working it themselves. Not only was this unacceptable to Cluniacs, it was in direct opposition to the sacred role of the monk. If monks were tending the land, then they weren't praying and living a life devoted entirely to God. It was time the monks got back to basics. Now, one way was to farm out their farms, so to speak, meaning have others work the land and then pay the landowning clergy a cut. This reduces the monks to the role of manager and overseer rather than laborer, thus freeing up far more of their time to devote toward their sacred vows. Now, here's where we see a blinding light of irony. Where Cluniacs exchanged their farmers' hats for their employer hats, they also began raking in a massive amount of money. So don't let the seeming simplicity and frugality fool you here. These Cluniac monks enjoyed lavish meals, silverware and cutlery, and even some trendy threads in many areas. Pope Leo IX sought to bring in as many monasteries and holy places into line as quickly as possible. Otherwise, without this uniformity across Europe, this first bending of the knee, one could describe it, then the rest of his reforms might prove a bit more difficult. The rest of his reforms? Yeah. See, as with the economic structure of a monastery, Pope Leo IX believed that the clergy should, as I've said, devote themselves entirely to the worship, praise, and spread of God's word. At the time, the official rules on whether a priest or an abbot or a bishop could take a wife or a mistress were, well, a little wishy-washy. At the end of the day, if you weren't adamantly against it, then you just kind of looked the other way. Let's just say a lot of rulers looked the other way. This meant that these clergymen would have the audacity, if you can believe it, to give some attention to their families, or, other carnal desires. At the Easter Synod of 1049, just weeks after he donned that sweet hat, Pope Leo IX reminded everyone of the tradition of celibacy the church conveniently forgot about somewhere in the 9th, maybe 10th centuries. And at the same meeting, he introduced rules against another common practice, though some areas of Europe were far worse than others. It was called simony, and this was the practice, simony, of selling ecclesiastic offices. Throughout England, Normandy, and southern Italy, the practice of simony was rampant, so it seemed Pope Leo IX already kind of had it out for the Normans, whether they were Normans from Normandy or southern Italy. Remember, as devoutly Catholic as Normans were, and make no mistake, they still did what they wanted to do when they wanted to do it. So, to get this straight, Pope Leo IX had three major reforms he began with. Number one, top-to-bottom organizational alignment within the church, with the papacy clearly at the top. Number two, all clergy, from subdeacon to bishop, including the Pope, are to remain celibate without exception. And number three, simony is illegal, period. Along with Emperor Henry III, Pope Leo IX left on a whirlwind victory lap around Europe, and while on this trip, he heard one of his Norman brethren, one Duke William I, making a move to ally his duchy with the powerhouse Duchy of Flanders, which gave Leo IX a golden opportunity to introduce one of his other pet reforms, based on consanguinity. See, William was about 24 years old at this time, and if you remember, he just a few years before finally subdued his own rowdy duchy at the Battle of Valesdune. And he was now looking forward to begin building alliances with others in the region. And there was the beautiful daughter of the Count of Flanders, Matilda, just 4 years or so younger, whose father was also looking for worthwhile alliances. Letters were exchanged, terms were agreed upon, a wedding date was set. So romantic. But then there was the small issue of consanguinity, the rules that determined marriages within certain degrees of kinship. Basically, William and Matilda were third cousins, and the church mandated no one was allowed to marry within 7 degrees from one another. This, to Pope Leo IX, was a satisfying first volley thrown at these Normans. But again, Normans don't mess around. And knowing William already, we know that he won't just sit idly by and be threatened or, dictated to. William pushed the marriage anyway. And finally, in 1051, they were married, solidifying the alliance between Normandy and Flanders, which will echo over the next few decades. Pope Leo IX decreed this marriage null and void. But all of Europe saw William thumbing his nose up at this powerful pope. Everyone cowed a bit at this new powerful pope, but not William, and not his fellow Normans to the south of Rome either. Having won several intra-organizational battles within the church already, this lost battle of wills against this young, brash Norman duke, well, it was a nice big public shiner on Pope Leo IX's early papal reputation. The wedding was held, the Pope publicly denied its legitimacy, and life went on, and everybody again saw it. Leo had no choice but to try to send a message to these other Normans who seemed to be pounding on his own southern doors. Tensions between Rome, the southern Lombard principalities, the Greeks from Calabria to Apulia, and the native Italians were rising, and the mercury kept climbing upwards as more and more Normans left their crowded homeland and poured into the peninsula. There would be a reckoning at some point, but it's not as if Pope Leo IX was simply unaware or not taking it seriously. In fact, while he was making his way across Europe, tackling these new reforms and also taking that shot at Duke William's marriage, he also managed to slip away and take a tour of southern Italy as well. I mean, this guy probably didn't sleep at all, really, during his papacy. In late 1049 to early 1050, most likely taking advantage of the change of seasons and getting the heck out of northern Germany during the winter, he was able to make visits and have serious conversations with his southern nobility about the issue of the Normans and their oppressive presence. The number one complaint he seemed to hear was through letters he received from minor nobles throughout Europe, trying to peacefully make their way to Monte Gargano, the exact holy site where those very first Normans stopped and were approached by Lombards for help way back in 1016. They couldn't make their pilgrimage without being harassed, roughed up, and sometimes treated violently by these Normans. One such pilgrim was Abbot John of Fécamp, who wrote to Leo after his own experience in and out of Monte Gargano. He wrote, quote, "Italian hatred of the Normans has now become so great that it is near impossible for a Norman, even if he be a pilgrim, to travel through the cities of Italy without being set upon, abducted, stripped of all he has, beaten and tied with chains, all this if he does not give up the ghost in a fetid prison." End quote. Give up the ghost obviously means rot and die, right? That's how they felt. Naturally, it wasn't just the Normans committing the atrocities against others. It's the fact that the cities, even within Norman-held territory, were hassling outside Normans every chance they got. Resentment is bitter. Retaliation is the product. Outright hatred, now that's how it's shown. Benevento was the fiercely independent Lombard principality to Rome's east and southeast. But they were also northern neighbors of Norman territory, that is Melfi, and the Beneventans were getting very nervous lately. See, for the last 2 decades, Norman attentions were held south, but since the Byzantines in southern Apulia were pretty quiet at the time, and the Normans solidified agreements with Prince Guillemar of Salerno, the major Lombard principality in between Calabria and Apulia, well, the Normans began pushing in all directions, looking for any and every weakness they could find in the fences, like the velociraptors in Jurassic Park. And Benevento seemed like a pretty soft spot at the time. Norman knights had already stolen the mountain passes near Bovino and Troia, making pilgrimages, trade, and even possible military movement damn near impossible without them catching wind of it. Beneventans began writing to Pope Leo IX for help. The Pope offered his support. Then they began calling for audience with the Pope and pleading for direct assistance against this invasion. The Pope agreed to terms regarding ecclesiastic decrees and statements condemning Norman behaviors. And it was during this time, mid to late 1050, that Pope Leo IX wrote a letter to, of all places, Constantinople. Specifically, he bypassed Patriarch Michael Cerularius, who we will talk about another time, and he went straight to Emperor Constantine IX. Unbeknownst to him, though, Constantine IX would be the last in the long and illustrious Macedonian dynasty of Byzantine emperors, but that's beside the point. Basil II, for listeners of the show, Basil II, or Basil the Bulgar Slayer, was probably the Macedonian dynasty's golden child, to give you an idea. Pope Leo IX wrote that these southern Normans, quote, "with an impiety which exceeds that of pagans, rise up against the Church of God, causing Christians to perish by new and hideous tortures, sparing neither women, children, nor the aged, making no distinction between what is sacred and what is profane, despoiling churches, burning them and razing them to the ground." End quote. Yeah, Pope Leo IX is, he's being pretty wicked with his pen there. A lot of propaganda in that one. Then again, there's a lot of truth in there too. Well then, during the first months of 1051, the Pope received a new delegation from Benevento. They were different people altogether. To be sure, these were men from Benevento, but these men were products of a little insurrection within the principality itself. See, the people of Benevento were sick and tired of their highest nobility dragging their feet on a solution. So, being fiercely independent Beneventans, they took matters into their own hands, and they overthrew their leaders. These were the new de facto representatives from Benevento, and they laid their principality right at Pope Leo IX's feet. A Lombard principality giving him an unconditional surrender? How could he refuse? But even this agreement between Benevento And Pope Leo IX didn't intimidate errant Norman knights from doing as they pleased. They not only renewed their raids into Beneventan territory, but they also increased the terror with which they did it. The Pope couldn't have been more furious. One Norman in the north already embarrassed this Pope on an international scale. Now these Normans in the south were upping the ante. But Pope Leo IX had a reputation as a man capable of making peace with even the bitterest of enemies, and that's exactly what he decided to do. Live up to his reputation. The time came for another meeting. Everyone hoped this would be their last. Pope Leo IX invited both the elected Norman leader Drogo de Hauteville and his Lombard ally and kinsman, Prince Guiomar of Salerno. And together they hammered out a deal to once and for all settle southern Italy down and begin to find common ground. Too much bloodshed, too much terror and resentment in the peasantry, too much disruption to everyone's economic interests. It had all become too much. We've mentioned this part already, but here's where we get caught up in today's narrative. With a renewed sense of purpose, Drogo de Hauteville left the meeting and journeyed south to Melfi, where he would discuss the meeting with his nobility and allies. According to Norwich, though, as soon as Drogo left, the Pope received news of horrific Norman attacks well into Benevento, and if you thought the Pope was angry before, well, he quickly scribbled out a letter that was meant to track Drogo down before he got to Melfi, so he was aware of what his own people were doing, because clearly Drogo wasn't. But almost as soon as he left, the messenger returned with the still sealed letter, with his own news. On the road to Melfi, Drogo had been assassinated. No one took credit for it, but like any murder mystery dinner, there were plenty of people who could have capitalized on Drogo's death and the subsequent fallout within the Norman ranks. Some have even pointed to the waning Byzantine presence in southern Apulia, still stinging from their embarrassing defeat to the Normans and Lombards a decade or two earlier. But that's some weak reasoning. Here's a better reason as to the possible Byzantine motive, one that strikes at the heart of the rift between Latin Christianity and Eastern Orthodox. Normans being Catholic, well, everywhere they went, they replaced everything Eastern Orthodox, including the clergy, with Catholic things and Catholic people. So there's that too. No one will ever know, though, who killed Drogo. But we do know how it happened. It was August 10th, 1051. Drogo was in one of his castles in present-day Montella, Italy. He entered the church for services that morning. A mysterious man named Rissus jumped out from behind the doors and stabbed him to death, right there on the spot. Drogo's body made a horrible, lifeless thud as it fell to the floor. Others in his company were killed before Rissus was taken down. And what's more, just like in the famous assassination of U.S. President Abraham Lincoln in 1865, Drogo wasn't the only Norman noble assassinated that day either. Many Norman nobles around Apulia were targeted and murdered that day in much the same way as some of those associated with Lincoln's presidential cabinet were targeted. It was a large-scale, premeditated, and deviously calculated conspiracy, that's for sure. The major Norman noblemen were summoned to Melfi to hear the news of Drogo's death, the news of the Pope's demands. The Normans were pretty particular about who they bent the knee to, and as unbelievably pious as they were, and believe me, despite how they come across, again, I want to continue to stress the Normans were almost as devout as one could get. They weren't very happy with how things just played out, though. Whatever these conspirators hoped would happen just didn't. And in fact, a pretty strong case could be made that it backfired completely. So they did what Normans did when their disrespected and elected leader was killed, and they were threatened. They voted to promote Humphrey de Hauteville, the next eldest Hauteville boy, to be their leader. Drogo was known as a sensible man, a reasonable and fair leader, God-fearing and modest, as Norwich puts it. Humphrey was those things too, but just not to the extent that Drogo was. So that was the first backfire. The second backfire was the fact that these Normans didn't scatter. Rather, they coalesced even more. You can say many negative things about Normans, but despite their own infighting, they, like any band of brothers, maybe have fought within their ranks, but they pulled even tighter when a threat from outside loomed. But before they could mount a force of their own, they heard whispers of something else happening in the background of Drogo's death. The next question on everybody's mind was, how were these Normans going to react? And no one was willing to hang around and wait for the answer. The Pope wasn't about to see it play out. See, what was going on in the background was Pope Leo IX immediately appealed to his kinsman and friend, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, for soldiers and resources to not only defend the Papal States and her allies against these Normans, but also to go on the offensive and put them in their place, if not kick them out entirely from the peninsula. The Pope and the Emperor met at Worms in December of 1052, and the Papal States officially picked up the vassalage of Benevento, which was a big W in the Pope's column. But as he was able to begin his march south with a military force, the Emperor called the soldiers back. It seems that Pope Leo IX's old rival, Bishop Gerhard of Eichstätt, turned Henry's attentions northward to Lorraine and Flanders, areas that were currently not playing nicely with their neighbors, the Holy Roman Empire's Duchy of Saxony, which was also Henry III's old duchy before taking the crown of Germany. There was no other option for the emperor to offer Rome either, because Hungary was also pestering Germany's other ally, the Kingdom of Bohemia. Needless to say, Europe was imploding at the moment. And it wasn't just Italy and Central Europe either. Here's a little sneak peek at our next season of the podcast. The early 1050s marked a monumentally important series of events in England as well, as that kingdom nearly devolved into an all-out civil war, and that's not even mentioning the several decades-long war between Norway and Denmark to this point. So luckily the emperor's librarian, librarian, but he was also a respected and influential clergyman too. Frederick was his name, and one day down the road, he would take the name of Pope Stephen IX, by the way. Well, Frederick the librarian helped Pope Leo IX out with 700 Swabian infantrymen, to which the Pope was eternally grateful. This, however, was only the seeds of an actual army, though. But the Pope was still pretty miffed, so he sucked up his pride and wrote to the Eastern Emperor, again, to send a force to Italy to help the Western Empire finally rid the peninsula of these invasive northern weeds. Remember, this was about a decade after the disastrous ending to George Maniaki's incredible conquest, and the emperor certainly remembered the shame and embarrassment of that episode in their illustrious history, but Constantinople never forgot their infatuation with the idea of Italian conquest, a way to rejoin the ancient lands as one single entity again. A man of Greek and Lombard descent named Archirus was currently Constantinople's Duke of Italy, Calabria, and Sicily, which, well, I mean, there are so many misconceptions in that title, it's not even worth the try to straighten it out. Suffice it to say that Constantinople's claim, they claimed a whole lot more of this region than they actually had. Either way, this man, Archirus, was a pretty cunning politician, and he was able to convince Emperor Constantine IX to hammer out a deal to help Rome rid the peninsula of the Normans. In fact, Archirus was so convincing that he was able to get the emperor to believe that the Normans, not the Turks, not the Muslims, not the Rus or whoever else, the Normans were the real and biggest threats against Constantinople at the moment. Now, Archirus just seems to get a little ahead of himself, but the Prussians here are strikingly eerie, I have to admit. It was here, in mid to late 1052, that Pope Leo IX, as he was calling in his favors and collecting his forces, sent a Hail Mary downfield. He wrote to Prince Gaimar of Salerno, the longtime Lombard ally of these Normans. Pope Leo IX reasoned that when his papal forces and allies defeated the Normans, then he simply couldn't give any assurances whatsoever of Byzantine retaliation towards Salerno, should Guiomar refuse the Pope's offer for an alliance. It was a long shot, to be sure, but Pope Leo IX was a pretty confident guy. He received a reply shortly afterward. Norwich writes that Prince Guiomar, quote, polite but firm, pointed out not only that he could never join any league against the Normans, but also that he would find it impossible to stand aside and allow them to be attacked. Initially, the Pope wasn't convinced the Salernitans would join his forces, but he never anticipated them fighting against him. This rocked the Pope to the core. And it seemed to rock everyone else too, because without the Pope's knowledge, Prince Guiomar made that appeal and the response a very publicized exchange, which served to shake the very ground the Pope stood on. No one wanted to be on the losing end of a battle in which the Normans were triumphant. But again, everyone heard about it. And another conspiracy was hatched. One that soon saw to the death, another death, of Prince Guiomar himself. Killed by his own brothers-in-law, in fact. And Guiomar wasn't the only casualty there. Pretty much every member of his family who were loyal to the Normans, well, they were killed as well. Except for one, Duke Guy of Sorrento. Melfi and Salerno were Sorrento's only allies. In a harrowing escape, Guy made it back safely to Melfi, where he found his brother-in-law was elected leader of the Normans. That's right, Humphrey de Hauteville was married to Guy of Sorrento's sister. Though things were collapsing around the Normans and their allies, there were very tiny shining lights to hold on to in the darkness. As it happens, Prince Guiomar's young son was too young to have a horse in this race, so he was spared by the purging. His name was Gisulf, and after this episode, he would go on to become the Prince of Salerno. Little spoiler alert there. The Prince of Salerno like his father Guiomar, but in a sadly ironic but completely foreseeable twist. His reign would mark the official end of Salerno as an independent principality forever, when in 1075, the Normans took it over. These Normans. At this point, without Salerno or Sorrento on their side, the Normans realized they were pretty much on their own. By the spring of 1053, they could only make preparations and watch the playing field take shape around them, all the while dealing with southern Italy, inside and outside Norman territory, watching it devolve into something resembling the worst parts of anarchy. I mean, Italy was a mess at this point. Also at this point, on the other side of the coin, the Pope was cautiously optimistic as he continued to grow his military strength. Gibbon describes the Pope's forces in a not-so-friendly light, though. Gibbon says, quote, in this long progress, from Mantua to Beneventum, a vile and promiscuous multitude of Italians was enlisted under the holy standard. The priest and the robber slept in the same tent. The pikes and crosses were intermingled in the front, and the martial saint repeated the lessons of his youth in the order of march, of encampment, and of combat. End quote. When it came to ridding this peninsula of Normans, the Pope would take anyone willing, period. And there were a lot of people willing. By early June 1053, the Duchy of Gaeta, the counties of Aquino and Teano and Amalfi were all there, in addition to Pope Leo IX's own Papal States forces. Along with them were the Swabian mercenaries from southern Germany, militia specifically from Rome itself and the surrounding communities, Campania, loyalists from Apulia, Marsi, Ancona, Spoleto, the Kingdom of Lombardy, and Capua, had also pledged their support to the Pope. And the cherry on top for the Pope were the Byzantines, currently undocking and forming up in southern Apulia and ready to march northward. Excluding his few thousand strong contingency heading their way, the Pope amassed a massive force of his own of over 6,000 soldiers under his command. Yeah, The Pope was leading his own army into battle, and he headed into Benevento. He was hoping to time it just right so that he would catch the Normans off guard in Melfi from the north, while the Byzantines arrived and pinched them in from the south, cutting off really any escape. See, the problem is, again, though, they're dealing with Normans here. And the Pope was at the head of a truly massive force for Italy in the 11th century. 6,000 was a huge army, and the fact that it consisted of over 700 Swabians answering the Pope's call to arms, who'd traveled from southern Germany, definitely caused enough commotion that people were bound to find out what was going on. Humphrey de Hauteville heard about this, and he called every able-bodied Norman knight to his side in Melfi, as well as those from Salerno and Sorrento, willing to give it up at home, to give it all up at home, in order to fight for their allies. A surprise came when Richard of Aversa also brought knights at his side. Side note here, Richard was a Drangot brother, and he had a falling out with Drogo years ago. In fact, Richard Drangot was a prisoner of Drogo's until Prince Guiscard successfully helped him make bail. Either way, in the previous couple years, Richard had somehow made an infant son of the Count of Aversa disappear, and he jumped into that role. So that's how Count Richard of Aversa was in a position to help the Norman cause in 1053. Humphrey wasn't disappointed when his little brother Robert, already widely known again as Robert Guiscard, showed up with hundreds of Normans and Calabrians at his side. Nearly the entire Norman army had serious misgivings about going to battle against God's right-hand man on earth. It's almost like they were going to war against God himself. Records indicate that many Normans were ready to abandon this particular engagement because of this fact, and keeping this fact a secret for as long as possible seemed like a PR nightmare for Humphrey. The Pope heard about them gathering their forces, and he couldn't believe the gall these Frenchmen had. Opposing the Vicar of Christ? Are you kidding me? It was bad enough that their young, flashy Duke William the Bastard had just upstaged them. The Pope and thousands of Swabians and Lombards to the north, thousands more Greeks, Pechenegs, and Bulgarians to the south, and hundreds of Normans in between. It's no surprise that Humphrey heard about this pincer move, and so he made a tough decision. Humphrey took his men north, diminishing space between his Normans and the Pope's Germanic forces. But in diminishing space between him and the Pope, he was by consequence creating space between him and the Byzantine forces. Byzantines were a formidable force with, seemingly nearly endless resources for war, as was already seen when the Normans were hired by the likes of Maniakes for his escapades in Sicily. But they were in some serious turmoil back in their capital, and rumors of Muslim Turks beginning to encroach on Anatolia succeeded in turning much of their attention momentarily eastward in the 1050s. On the flip side, the Papal States was far closer to home, and they had the backing of not only most of the Lombard presences in Italy, but it also garnered massive influence over the mighty Holy Roman Empire. If Humphrey could lead himself to victory over the Byzantines, what would be gained? They were far too away to hold much sway over their futures, like at all. However, if Humphrey could lead his Normans to victory over the Pope's forces, well, that might just lead to some dealings with the real power in Italy besides the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Emperor. This was Humphrey's gamble. To the benefit of Humphrey's Norman contingent, though he may not quite be aware of it yet, Humphrey had one of the Middle Ages' most enduring legends joining him in his march toward the Pope. Again, his little brother, Robert de Hauteville. By this time, Robert earned the nickname again of Robert Guiscard, meaning Robert the Clever. But that's the nice interpretation. That's the interpretation one uses when they don't really have an opinion on the matter. Depending on which side you are on for the next 3 decades, you could see Guiscard also meaning either the fox or the weasel. In addition to Humphrey's brother, Robert Guiscard and his knights from Calabria and Richard Drangot, this all amounted to just over half the total number of the Pope's forces, around 4,000 men. But here's the thing. The Pope's forces consisted mostly of infantry, thousands of infantry, while the Norman army only had several hundred infantry, while the rest were Norman knights. Here's the kicker: knights on horseback. Anyone playing at home can clearly see that though the Normans were severely undermanned, they were, in fact, far ahead in their dominance on the battlefield. Remember, the Norman reputation for excelling in cavalry warfare was already in full swing around Europe. This was, as we've already discussed, due in large part to the technological innovations that took hold just a generation before, around the turn of the millennium, with the creations and adoptions of the raised saddle, the nailed horseshoe, and the stirrup. One cannot overlook the absolute game changers these simple inventions were. By keeping the Pope's army from joining the Byzantine forces, Humphrey hoped to obliterate any dominance over his Norman subjects. It was really his only hope to survive this threat. On June 17th, 1053, while the papal forces were gathered outside of the walled Italian town of Civitate, Humphrey de Hauteville's forces approached cautiously but confidently from the southeast. Humphrey organized his army. Richard Drengot had an entirely cavalry unit on the right flank. Humphrey charged his rambunctious little brother, Robert Guiscard, to lead the left flank with half Norman cavalry and half Calabrian infantry. And Humphrey himself led the bulk of the army in the center, with Norman archers, cavalry, and infantry. The Pope, on the other side, had chosen 2 main contingents, not 3. The one on the center and left consisted of infantry and archers, while the one on the right was a disorganized cluster of Lombards with, well, whatever they could use to fight with. Pope Leo IX oversaw the battle from behind his forces, up on the walls of the town. So, there they were. Just outside of an archer's distance, these 2 armies stared at one another for a day or two. And in the meantime, each camp was reacting in their own ways, and both ways seriously undermined the war effort. The Pope's forces were having second thoughts. I mean, these were the Normans. Who cares if their army was half of their own? And as for the Normans, these devout Catholics still couldn't wrap their heads around facing off and potentially killing the leader of the entire Latin Church. And to be clear, Humphrey wasn't exactly a huge fan of it either, which is why he sent messenger after messenger after messenger with appeals for peace. And each messenger came back with a message which is summed up simply as, "I'm the Pope, and I'm here to win." But Humphrey was also weighing his eternal soul against the far more immediate threat of that looming pincer move. Recent reports state that the Byzantine army had already made port in the southern Apulian city of Bari and was currently marching north, mere days or even hours away. If Humphrey was going to act, it had to be soon. In the meantime, almost comically, the Lombards and Swabians were taunting the Normans, screaming across no man's land about leaving the peninsula and going back to France. Also, Normans were genetically Scandinavian, and many northern Europeans weren't exactly the tallest people. Lombards, Italians, Swabians, they, on average, certainly had a few inches on these Normans, and they reminded the Normans of this fact over and over again. Taunting isn't really good in any age, but in the age of the honor code, well, it did the trick, and the Normans slowly became annoyed, which at that point quickly turned to anger. It seemed to become less about the Pope and more about silencing these insolent Germans. These Normans were itching to fight at this point, and Humphrey was itching for the Pope to stand his men down and reach an agreement. Time was ticking. The Byzantines were fast approaching. As little as Humphrey wanted to fight the Pope, he knew he simply couldn't wait any longer. It was clear the Pope was stalling. Humphrey gave the order, not even waiting on his latest messenger to return with the Pope's reply. He already knew what it was anyway. Richard Drengot led his contingent on the right to draw out the mob of Lombards, who had no real commander, as it was made up of smaller groups of men from specific communities, and they didn't all get along with the next group either. They were largely untrained and undisciplined. The Normans, however, were the exact opposite, and it was a bloodbath. Within an hour, Lombards were seen retreating, and within several minutes, the Lombard infantry was being steadily pushed back by Norman dominance on the battlefield. In the middle, Humphrey ordered his men forward, but not without a flurry of arrows to cut down the enemies who had been drawn toward them. By the time the two sides clashed, the arrows ceased and the archers joined the fight. Again, these were highly skilled and experienced Normans, and the Pope's center held for a time. Richard Drango's men had pushed the Lombard left all the way back to the town's walls, and the Lombards fled into the city, some even fleeing all the way back home, probably. That freed Richard and his cavalry to encircle the Pope's center, currently engaged with Humphrey's center. Richard's men came from the rear of the Pope's forces, and the Normans collapsed inward, pushing hard, cutting down every Lombard and Swabian, and finally meeting in the middle. The sad thing is that it's said that the Lombards and Swabians had seen Richard's men coming in the distance and reformed for a split-second decision. They decided to die there on the battlefield, doing what they could for their honor and the honor of their families back home. It strikes me that we don't know these men's stories. It's not the Humphreys and the Richards and the Guiscards and Popes that have made the real difference throughout history. It's these men on the field, right there, outside of Civitate in the year 1053. These men and their sacrifices to fight for something they truly believed in, or just their, obligatory decision. It's those men whose stories we don't really know. These are the men who continually are undervalued throughout history. I don't know. I guess this is my way of, recognizing them for whatever it's worth. And in equal measure, what about their wives and mothers and sisters and daughters back in Swabia and Lombardy and wherever? They too are equally responsible for the greatness of humankind. Without the responsibilities at home being kept, the men wouldn't have anything to fight for, as well as anything to come home to. These women are just as much a part of any war effort as the men dying on the battlefields. It kind of brings life 1,000 years ago to our current present. If someone can tell me how it's different, I'm all ears. So it's clear that the Pope had been routed. Embarrassingly, actually. By the time Robert Guiscard joined the fray and dealt with the remaining flank, Richard and Humphrey were rounding toward him to help. But they just weren't needed. Richard was left to organize the Norman knights and do a sweep of the battlefield in the wake of the skirmish, while Humphrey and Robert rode confidently toward the walls of Civitate to suggest peace terms. Richard Drango and his men, having no other choice really, simply took the weapons and gear and other valuables off of the dead and then dug graves beside the bodies. And that was the cleanup of the Battle of Civitate. There are two stories for how this next part played out, the part in which the Pope actually surrendered. One was the people of Civitate, who had literally just watched this battle, decided they wanted nothing of these Normans, and they threw the Pope out on his backside. That one's my favorite. The other story, however, is probably the one that is most likely, which is that the Pope proudly walked out of the gates toward these two mounted Norman knights, that is Humphrey and Robert Guiscard. Either way, what happened next is the same in all versions. To everyone's surprise, both Humphrey and Robert, as well as their entire contingent of Norman knights behind them, dismounted and immediately fell to their knees. As I said, these were very pious men. That's why I stressed it earlier. And what they had done was won a decisive victory for their very livelihoods in Italy. There was no more animosity than that. They were still servants of their Pope, and they begged his forgiveness. And it's shocking to me. And it's also very telling of these southern Normans. The ability to separate a person from a group, to see the trees for the forest, so to speak. This could be argued to be a measure of an individual, especially when violence is a result of such a disagreement. And there's a lesson for our own times here somewhere, I'm sure of it. But in the end, after the Pope forgave their sins, the men stood, conscience clear, and in pure Norman fashion, they took the Pope hostage. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, in which the Normans defeated Pope Leo IX outside of the town of Civitate in a test of wills for the 11th century heart of the Italian peninsula. Please keep sharing this podcast with those you know and on your social media accounts. Don't forget to tag us too if you share us on Twitter @WheelPodcast, or drop a quick line about the latest episode on Facebook, Fortune's Wheel Podcast. We've also expanded to the Good Pods app, so I encourage you to head over there and to stay in touch too. Also, you can email the show at fortuneswheelpodcast@gmail.com, and please consider supporting the show on both Anchor and Patreon if you are so inclined. With southern Italy still a bit chaotic, our Norman antiheroes have landed, finally, on solid ground with regards to their standing. Before the Battle of Civitate, they were merely a nuisance, a major threat against the power structure, a fad that will eventually, as many, many cultures and peoples across the millennia have already done in this area, melt right into the fabric of Italian hegemony. Today, these United States are known as the melting pots of the world, and in many cases that is the truth. However, I also see the 11th century Italy in much the same way, only with a far deeper past. For the time being, we're going to leave these southern Normans of the mid-1050s in the very capable hands of Humphrey de Hauteville and his younger brother, Robert Guiscard, and we're going to look north again. On the next episode, though, we're calling a timeout, and we're trying a new format on the podcast. It's a slight change, but telling the story of the late Middle Ages comes with many challenges. But one of the hardest I'm trying to sort out is how to keep things within the same context. This is a big, big story we're telling here on the podcast. At the beginning of our bends in the narrative, or seasons, whatever you want to call them, I'm going to start to not only quickly review where we've been and what we've discussed that has led to our new storyline, but also take a peek at where we're about to dive into. So, next episode, we introduce our new season of the podcast. I can't wait to tell you about it.